And most recently, he is the author of this book, The Textual Integrity of Sahih Bukhari, a study on the primary recensions, textual variants, and transmission of the Sahih by, there we are, see the author at the bottom there. It's actually a very nice cover, I think.
I want to focus on something very specific, and that is becoming somewhat of a trend in this hyper-skeptical society that we live in. And that is what we call the textual integrity of Sahih al-Bukhari. What I mean by textual integrity is there's two ways of looking at this, on a macro scale and on a micro scale. What do I mean by this? On a micro scale, a very fundamental question that over the last few decades some have began questioning was, did Imam Bukhari even write a book that we know today as Sahih al-Bukhari? Was it, posthumously fabricated? Is it the result of pseudepigraphy? We don't have any certainty because of the lack of manuscripts, or it's been 1,000 years. A number of objections people have put forward. So that's like on a macro level. And honestly, there's a British historian, his name is Norman Calder. In 1994, he has this study on the history of Islamic law. And it's not related only to Sahih al-Bukhari, but a number of very early Islamic texts, starting with the Muwatta, to the Musannaf, to Imam Bukhari's collections and others. He, based on obviously the Western academic, highly skeptical worldview of doubting anything that's, a millennium or older, he posits that we cannot rely on it. Therefore, not only Sahih al-Bukhari, but other collections are so far behind that we should assume that they're the product of Islamic intellectual civilization. So that's one argument. And Calder's position has been honestly refuted on multiple occasions. Like the famous Harold Motsky took him to task because of the Musannaf, on the basis of Musannaf Abdul Razzaq. A number of scholars have questioned his take on the Muwatta, such as Dr. Umar Abdullah here in Chicago and others. So it became very clear that his premises are really very, very weak and his arguments are untenable. However, we need to move on to what I phrase as on a micro scale. On a more granular level, let's say we assume the inscription of this collection, Sahih al-Bukhari, to Imam al-Bukhari. The question is, how much of Sahih al-Bukhari aligns with the collections we have today? So let's say he wrote it. What assurances do we have that the first hadith to the last hadith that he had initially compiled over 1,200 years ago is the same as the ones we have today? But even on the level of content, scholars would engage with the content as well. Like, for instance, we have anachronisms, and people often assume that identifying anachronisms is somehow something unique to the HCM.
Yes.
But if you look at some of the earliest scholars, even Imam al-Bukhari himself, he has a famous collection called At-Tarikh al-Kabir, which is on the biographical information of narrators. And you see the way he engages with some of the reports. He doesn't take it for granted that some things seem anachronistic or they conflict with other reports, even though ostensibly the transmission is authentic. And that's what I would like to point out, that these weren't gullible storytellers that would just ask, okay, just give me a list of names and I would accept it. In fact, there's this one paper someone had written in Germany. It was like the late 70s or 80s. He writes this paper trying to say that if you look at the Torah and the Talmud, and even if you look at the Vedas, they also have some semblance of an isnad as well. You'll see that Rabbi so-and-so, if you open up the Talmud, there are multiple examples of, Rabbi Ezra heard from Rabbi so-and-so who said this. The problem with a lot of these, what you can call forms of isnad, is that just having a list of names is meaningless if you can't do anything with that data. The famous Andalusian scholar Ibn Hazm, he actually points this out, saying that you can cite names, but what distinguishes Muslim civilization is the second part, which is the field of narrator criticism and the volumes upon volumes of biographical data we have of the names in this chain of transmission.
Right.
So my point is like what really distinguishes Muslim civilization is how meticulously they documented the lives of every individual who dared to say that the Prophet ﷺ said something.
Right.
In fact, even at the expense of their own family relationships, a number of these scholars were asked, oh, your father is narrating such and such. Ali ibn al-Madini, one of the famous Basran scholars, teacher of Imam al-Bukhari, was once asked, we want to narrate some hadith from your father. What do you think? So he like puts his head down and he's a little ashamed. So he doesn't answer. And upon pressing him, he's like, if you want to know the honest truth, don't take your father. He's weak. So the point is, for them, it wasn't a matter of personal agendas. They were willing to put their lives on the line for this. So the growing concern of hadith fabrication, how did scholars deal with it? One, I call it the twin kind of modes of defense. One is asking for your sources, isnad, and the second is to document the lives of these purported sources to see whether or not we can accept this information or not. Right. The famous Austrian Orientalist Alois Sprenger, who spent quite some time in India, passed away in the late 1800s. He actually writes in one place that the Muslim civilization is unparalleled in the fact that they documented the lives of hundreds of thousands of people just so that they can determine whether or not their history is reliable. And this is coming from a non-Muslim who acknowledges this, because he couldn't help but say, this is phenomenal. Now, we know that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were largely unlettered. So they didn't know how to write or read or write. But the few that did know how to write and read, coupled with the lack of writing material, they sufficed on a mode of writing which we can call the sahifa. Just scrolls, basic notes, nothing too fancy, just enough to get by. A basic map of the region in which Imam al-Bukhari is born. If you see that river, the Oxus River, it's a very famous river. In Islamic history, they talk about ma wara an-nahar, transoxiana, beyond the river. So where Imam Bukhari was from, the regions of Samarkand, he was from that region. And now ma dun an-nahar, what is beneath the nahar, that river, you have Khurasan, Nishapur, modern day Iran and Afghanistan. But where Imam al-Bukhari was from is Bukhara and those regions, which is modern day Uzbekistan. Now, eventually, by the year 250, he's reaching, obviously the common era and the Hijri date, his age differs. But based on the common era, we're looking at the age of 55. He now returns back to the eastern regions where he's going to visit. He's going back home, basically. And he initially comes to Nishapur and he's welcomed with open arms. However, there's a local scholar over there with whom there's a disagreement over the highly contentious issue of the createdness of the Quran. Khalqul Quran, whether the Quran is created or not. Now, Imam al-Bukhari's position was actually very mainstream and clear-cut. But at that time, it was one of those radioactive issues that like just touching it would get you into problems. And one thing led to another, and Imam al-Bukhari becomes on the receiving end of a lot of slander and misinformation. And he is exiled from Nishapur. He eventually goes to Maru. And then he settles in a place called Farabar. Farabar is important. Like if you look at, apologies, I have to go to the previous slide. If you see Bukhara, where there's a star, and right beneath it, you have Farabar. It's near the river. That's an important place. He actually spends 3 years over there. And that name's going to be important when we talk about Farabari, when we get there. But he spent 3 years in Farabar. He does a few things. He completes his Sahih al-Bukhari. And in fact, he was part of the army over there protecting the frontiers, because that's the river and any invading army first point of entry would be that region of Farabar. So he actually actively served in the army during those 3 years. He was writing. In fact, they talk about his physical stature. They say he was average height, very fit and lean. He would go for archery every morning. And if you would see him, you would see someone who didn't seem like the average person. He was both, as they say, bastatan fil ilmi wal jism. In terms of his intellectual prowess and physical prowess, he was very impressive. Now, eventually, Imam al-Bukhari, he is, he travels from place to place. He goes back to Bukhara for a moment, and the Tahirid Amir at the time, he would invite scholars to his court to educate him, his family, and his close connections. So when Imam al-Bukhari, in the final year of his life, comes to Bukhara, the Tahirid Amir, Khalid ibn Ahmad al-Tahiri, he's obviously aware that Bukhari comes, and he invites him to also, present and talk about, his Sahih and Tarikh al-Kabir. Imam al-Bukhari says, look, I will not debase knowledge by bringing it to the footsteps of a ruler. If you want knowledge, come to us in the masjid where everybody else, even the layman, can benefit from it. Knowledge isn't this elitist, exclusivist property. If you want it, you come here. Now, obviously, being a ruler, that rubbed him the wrong way. It ruffled his feathers. And harping on to the controversy of the Quran that had already affected Imam al-Bukhari, he exiles Imam al-Bukhari. Just by the way, if you look at the screen, you see that manuscript over there. That is actually currently the earliest dated extant manuscript of Sahih al-Bukhari. It's actually Bayal in the Birmingham Library in the Mingana collection. It's several folios of the Sahih, dated to possibly the 3rd century, the early 4th century. So it's very, very late. It's what they call an alfiya, over 1,000 years old. Mingana has a very long discussion of it, and in my book, I kind of I critique some of his arguments, because if the earliest dated manuscript, there's a lot to be learned from it. This is Sahih al-Bukhari. He writes it over 16 years. In fact, he only completes the compilation of the Sahih. There's a lot of research on this, and I would implore anyone interested to read my book so that they don't think I'm saying something wrong. But when did he finish writing the Sahih? In a summary, the evidence that we have suggests he wrote it, he completed it about 2 or 3 years before he passed away.
Right.
And during that time, thousands of people heard him, because obviously he was in Farabar, he was in Bukhara. In these masajid, everyone was attending. When I say thousands of people, obviously not every person was a bona fide scholar. People would come and attend and listen. Although we have hundreds and thousands of people supposedly who heard from him, in terms of documented evidence, we know of about 25 who heard from him. But even from those 25, only one exists today, meaning one recension. When I say recension, I think it's important to understand, what do I mean? Imagine Imam al-Bukhari is sitting in the Grand Mosque of Farabar, and he begins dictating and teaching his Sahih to all the attendees. So there are hundreds of people over there listening, each person taking notes, copying the Sahih as they're going through it. Because that time you didn't have a printing press. If you wanted a compilation or collection of what's being taught, you needed to write it yourself. So either in class, before class, they're writing out the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. And eventually, over time, if you had, say, hypothetically, 100 students, now you have 100 recensions of Sahih al-Bukhari. Each scribe, each student represents what he managed to hear, what he managed to write. If some days he was there, some days he wasn't there, there's going to be omissions. If he made a mistake, those mistakes would also be there. Now, you have all of these recensions. When these scholars then go to their respective regions back, one person goes to Baghdad, one person goes to Khurasan, one person goes to Mecca, they repeat the same phenomenon. In the Grand Mosque, they will teach their students who have their copies of it. So I think this is important, because when we look at the students of Imam al-Bukhari and their copies, we can use the term recension, their versions of what they learned and transcribed from Sahih al-Bukhari. And then each recension, their students, we can call those sub-recensions. Is the transmission of Sahih al-Bukhari mutawatir? I would argue that when it mattered most, it was mutawatir. Right. It's just that it has reached us by the time the collections were already documented, it was well spread, well known. Then it coalesced into one basic route of transmission. What do I mean by this? When Imam al-Bukhari taught dozens of people, they were also transmitting to their students. And they were transmitting to their students as well. In fact, in my book, I chart out how Sahih al-Bukhari kind of proliferated, at least based on documented evidence. So it was widely transmitted for the first 1 or 2 centuries.
Right.
It was only after a century or two where certain nodes, certain points of transmission became more important than others, that people thought, look, there's 20 ways I could learn Sahih al-Bukhari. I'm going to go to the most famous, shortest chain because that earns me the greatest amount of authority. And when everybody begins thinking like this over generation, through a process of elimination, you only have one route remaining. So today we only have one route. But if you went maybe 30, 40 years after the life of Imam al-Bukhari, you could find different transmission routes going back to him.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Now, I want to focus on this, the transmission of Sahih al-Bukhari. This is a truncated version. It's much more elaborate. It wouldn't fit on one screen. If we imagine Imam al-Bukhari teaching the Sahih to thousands of people, although Al-Farabri is the only extant recension, the one that we have today, there were others who also heard from Imam al-Bukhari, and their recension survived for centuries after Imam al-Bukhari. So just like today, if we went to the library, I have a few copies of the Sahih over here. If I opened a copy and I start to read it, well, I'm reading how it was transmitted by Al-Farabri and the sub-recension, his students. If you went back to the time of Al-Farabri, you could have done the same and opened up the copy of someone by the name of Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi from modern-day Qarshi, which is south of Bukhara. You had another one, Hamad ibn Shakir, another one, Bazdawi. These are other people who heard it. I just wanted to show this so that everyone can visualize on the left how you have Nasafi. He is an extremely important recension for our study. His name is Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi. He was the judge of Nasaf. Imam al-Bukhari, the year he had passed away, went to visit Nasaf because of the controversy. And he started teaching people in Nasaf. And Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil was one of the students who heard from him. He was already an established judge and scholar who has his own collections of hadith, but he decided to study with Imam al-Bukhari, and he even transmitted the Sahih to his students after that. The reason Farabri becomes more important than Nasafi is Al-Farabri lived for 25 years more than Nasafi. So although Nasafi was a more pivotal student, people would go to Farabri because of the chain being shorter. I can either study from a student of Nasafi, or I can go directly to Farabri. Imam al-Farabri lived for about 60 years after Bukhari, and teaching the Sahih became his sole vision and mission. That's why he was identified with the Sahih. So you can see over here, Farabri is our current extant recension. He has dozens of students who hear from him, and those students continue to hear from him. And you can imagine like a spider web, it's fanning out until it reaches the present day. Here are some questions. If we take all of the knowledge all of the information that we've gathered so far about Sahih al-Bukhari, here are some questions that are important for us today when we want to determine the textual integrity of Sahih al-Bukhari. Because what are the contentions? It's been 1,000 years. A whole host of things could have happened. The manuscripts could have been tampered, played around with, lost. Hadith could have been inserted. Another problem, we only have one version today. What if that version is unreliable? What do we do about Farabri? What do we know about him? Is he reliable, unreliable? How can we put so much confidence into something that literally is bottlenecked with one individual? So here are a few things. Question number one, how do we determine the accuracy of Farabri's recension? Like, how do I know that what I'm reading in Sahih al-Bukhari today is an accurate reflection of what Imam al-Bukhari had left for his students and for you and I by extension? Number two, although for 100, 200 years after al-Bukhari, the other transmission routes and their manuscripts were being taught, studied, and transmitted, within about 300 years, they vanished for reasons I just explained right now. Is there a way for us to reconstruct these versions so that we have an understanding of what they look like? And the last thing is if we want to know whether Farabri is reliable, the best way to do that is to compare his version with his peers. Number two, if there is this huge discrepancy and disparity, then that could make us doubt whether the Sahih that we have is reliable or not.
Yeah.
Okay, so few things to note about textual variants, right? As I mentioned, we don't have, back then, it was the pre-print world. If you wanted a copy of a book, you would have to write it yourself or listen to it in class. This led to number of variances, either because I didn't listen attentively, I missed a class, I was faster at writing than others. There could be numerous reasons. You know, in fact, there's that famous example, like sometimes we look back on the past and say, wait, how could there be differences? Like, why couldn't we just have one version? Well, we take for granted that we're able to print books today, but even in 1886, the Gettysburg Address of Lincoln, you know how some people think of it as this set in stone, perfect address? In fact, we have so many versions of it. Lincoln's own notes, people and news journalists who were there, people who heard it based on secondhand accounts. You take all of this together, something that wasn't even like 150 years ago, there's so many variations that, oh, was it this or that, or this word, did he say this, did he say that? So there are variations just as a human product. And I want to emphasize this because it is a product of human transmission of knowledge, that there are going to be variations. It's not something that we should look at as casting aspersions on scripture. It was a normal process. Number one, these variations we're talking about are not faith-shattering, consequential variations. One variation is, okay, a chapter says bab, another chapter says kitab. This hadith uses this verb, the hadith uses that verb. Oh, the Prophet ﷺ mounted a camel. Another one says, oh no, he mounted a red camel. These slight variations are very inconsequential. Right. But they are still important for people who are more interested in the niche things. Even if we had these variations, we're not talking about, oh, are we talking about Tawheed or no Tawheed? Are we talking, did the Isra happen or did it not happen? We need to stress this point because a lot of times I actually had a presentation on Sahih al-Bukhari just over the weekend, and someone came to me with this very issue saying that, you know, I run into a lot of missionaries who say, you know, why do you doubt the Bible and the transmission of the Bible when your hadith tradition is littered with variants? They're completely, apples and oranges don't even do justice in comparing the two, because the variances are, for instance, one narrator says, he narrated to me. Another version has, he informed me. We're talking about hair-splitting differences, nothing consequential to the faith. So I think that's important to bear in mind. The other question is, why did we only have Al-Farabri's version? There's just the economy of transmission. Although there were multiple versions, at some point, you couldn't travel far and wide. And when one person becomes the most renowned, everybody's going to study with that transmission. I just want to stress what we've spoken about right now, that there were multiple versions for over 100 or 200 years. By that time, the Sahih had already spread far and wide. The Sahih had already spread far and wide. Now it has reached us with only one version. Okay, here's the main argument here. If we want to determine whether Farabri's version is reliable, we want to compare with another version. Unfortunately, today we do not have, in extant form, in manuscript form, the whole Sahih al-Bukhari through other students. However, fortunately, what we do have is, from the time Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi, that other student of al-Bukhari I had spoken about, from the time he was teaching until about the 9th century of the Hijri calendar, who is the time of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the famous Mamluk era hadith juggernaut, until his time, that version of Sahih al-Bukhari did exist. And what a lot of scholars would do is, let's say I have Sahih al-Bukhari through the version of Farabri as recorded by him as my main text. What a lot of scholars would do is, while they had Nasafi's version next to them, they would note the variants from that version on the margins of the existing version. So to give you an example, if you look at the screen, this is just one manuscript. This is known as the famous Yuniniya manuscript, which deserves a presentation in and of itself. But do you see how in the margins you have some? So in the main text, you have the hadith, right? And then if you look in the margins, do you see the notes written in the margins in the words? I'm not sure if y'all can see it, but if you see those marginal notes, that those are the notes. And that is how people were able to document some of the variations. And those variations were eventually put into commentaries and other collections.
Okay, can I pause there? It's too juicy for me to bypass this. There is the famous Trinity verse in the New Testament. It's in the first letter of John, chapter 5, verse 7. It actually mentions the Trinity in the Bible. Now, scholars now know it was not part of the Bible. It was an interpolation. It was added to the Bible. How do they know that? Well, the same story. No one quotes it in the early church. No one knew about it. It's not there in the early manuscripts. The question is, how did it get in, though? Yeah. And it's a theory. I think it's a very good theory that many scholars subscribe to. It's not evidence, but it's a really good theory. Is that some scribe in their marginal notes, like we're looking at in your picture, wrote these words in 1 John 5 as a kind of commentary or a comment or a note or a clarification or a theological point. And then a subsequent scribe incorporated that note into the actual text itself. Wow. So what was actually an added note then got incorporated into the body of the Bible itself. And that's how it slipped in. I'm not sure how it could slip in, but that's the theory they have. So it was almost innocent, although I'm not sure it was entirely innocent. But it started life as a marginal comment and ended up being inserted by later transmitters who thought it should be in. And so it was added.
And that's interesting because we're not talking about a simple difference. That's the basis of their faith, right?
Oh, this is fundamental Christian theology. I mean, the Trinity this is it. And if you remove that from the Bible, and most modern translations now, with one exception, the New King James Version, this is the contemporary successor of the King James Version, still keeps it in. And so even though we know it's not there in the early Bibles, the most popular English translation insists on keeping that. Why? Because it's such an important verse. If you're a Christian, you've got to keep it in, they think. But it's dishonest because we know it's not original. It was inserted by accident or by design much, much later.
As a follow-up to that, you know what would ensure that such forms of interpolation didn't happen in the hadith tradition is, although they were noted in the margins, there were separate collections written. For instance, Qadi Iyad, the famous author of the Shifa, he had a book called Mashariq al-Anwar. In there, what he would do is he would note these variants and say, narrator X is responsible for this variant. Narrator Y is responsible for that variant. Right. So if hypothetically a marginal note somehow through the production of manuscripts found its way inside, anyone can just open up these manuals of variants and say, wait a second, this is actually not from this version. It should be taken out. And scholars would do their due diligence on that.
Amazing. And that didn't happen in the Christian tradition at all. It took the rise of biblical scholarship, biblical criticism in the 17th and 18th centuries, or mostly in the 19th century, to even begin to address these issues. Literally nearly 2,000 years after the first century, the Bible was, the New Testament was largely compiled. So the due diligence really didn't exist in the Christian world until very, very recently. And even now, most Christians are simply unaware of it. They simply have no idea what their own scholars are saying about these issues. Contrast that with the ulama who, as you say, people came to Bukhari. They needn't be scholars. They could be anyone who's interested to sit in and listen. Open house access, nothing hidden. It was demotic and universal. Very, very different experience within the ummah the ulama and the openness of knowledge transmission.
In fact, actually, it happened with the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. We heard about the Musnad Ahmad. There's this one person who attempted to include or interpolate 2 hadith. Now, just to give you some context, Musnad of Imam Ahmad has 30,000 hadith. So if somebody tried to insert a single hadith, it would have just like vanished. Like you wouldn't even notice. So a lot of the contemporaries, because of the numerous manuscripts and the fact that they had committed it to memory, when they read his version, immediately they realized, even though it's an inconsequential small hadith, they said, number one, this doesn't belong here. Number two, you don't belong here. So he was completely ostracized for an attempt at trying to interpolate Musnad Ahmad, which isn't even from the canonical hadith collections. You know, it's very interesting. In the field of qira'at, the science of hadith reading, there's a famous scholar who we call Ash-Shatibi. He's very famous, and he was a blind scholar. He had memorized Sahih al-Bukhari. He committed it to memory. So he was in Al-Andalus. When people would come read the Sahih to him, he didn't need a manuscript. He had memorized the whole text. He would correct them from memory and ensure that, you know, no funny business is happening and no one's trying to play around with the text.
Amazing.
So coming back to what I'm saying over here, that although we have Farabri's version in manuscript form, oral transmission, it's preserved today. If we just take Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi as a case study, his version was present to commentators who looked at his version and would say, oh, this is an interesting variant, I'm going to note it here. Oh, this is another important variant, I'll note it over here. We have dozens of books that note the variants of Nasafi's version for centuries because it existed with them. They considered Farabri the more important one, but they had it, so out of curiosity, they would note the differences, which is very important for us because although we do not have a complete manuscript based on the parallel Nasafi version of Sahih al-Bukhari, what we can do is we can reconstruct it based on the variants that are noted in the centuries of scholarship.
Right.
And that is basically what I attempted to do. That took me about 2 years sitting down with an Excel sheet, going manuscript to manuscript, book to book, commentary to commentary. It was I'll be honest with you, from the different works and papers that I've written, this was perhaps the most tedious, monotonous work I have done. Yeah, may Allah grant us all ikhlas and sincerity, and may we do it for His pleasure alone. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. So we have all of these variants in honestly hundreds of volumes of work and manuscripts and a lot of digitized information. Putting it all together, this is what I managed to collect over about a year and a half. So here are two graphs. The first important question is, do we have sufficient variants from a Nasafi's version that can give us a fair amount of confidence that we can reconstruct it? Meaning, did they only document maybe 5 or 10 variants? Then we can say for certain this is not a fair reconstruction.
Yeah.
But I argue that the number of variants, I've collected about 680 variants. But more important than just the variants themselves is the placement of the variants. So if you look at this graph over here, starting with hadith number 1, going all the way to hadith number 7,560, you can see that all of the variants are spread throughout. Meaning they didn't just focus on variants on chapter X or chapter Y. They noted variants in every single chapter available. Number one. Number two, I focus on 10 sources, starting with someone who lived a few decades after An-Nasafi, all the way to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani about 600 years later. About 10 sources, from manuscripts to original sources. If you gather all of these together exhaustively, you realize they had the manuscript and they were trying very hard to note every variant. So it's my argument that, in fact, we can meaningfully reconstruct the Sahih al-Bukhari through the version of Nasafi based on these variants. There could be some variants that are extremely inconsequential, but the fact that the commentary tradition did not feel it important to even include it, it either did not exist or it's so inconsequential it would not affect our analysis to begin with. So to just give you a sense of what type of variants are we talking about, in the main text, we'll have about 340 variants. What do I mean by a variant? Let's say one narrator has, he informed me, Farabri's version. The other one version has, he narrated to me. Very inconsequential, but I'm including it nonetheless. Sometimes it's a little bit more important. Let's say one hadith is summarized, or one hadith is not there, or whatever but those are very few. Maybe there are 10 hadith in terms of that are there in one, but not in the other. Apart from a particular section of hadith that I discussed later on. Then we have chapter headings, meaning, let's say Farabri has chapter on washing, chapter on performing wudu. Imam Nasafi will have it on as not the chapter on just making wudu, chapter on the best way to make wudu. Again, inconsequential, but nonetheless, why am I trying to do all of this? Because by looking at the inconsequential variants, if those are the only variants we have, then we can rest assured that the consequential content of Sahih al-Bukhari has reliably reached us. Then we have exegetical comments and author comments, and then I subdivide them into, okay, although Nasafi has about 680 variants, how many of them is he corroborated by other recensions? It gets very technical from this point. I will conclude with just a few questions. This is the conclusion with a few questions over here.
Okay.
So the conclusion is this. Somewhere between 93 to 99.9% of Sahih al-Bukhari is undisputed among the primary recensions. Meaning, after reconstructing Sahih al-Bukhari on Nasafi's version, when we compare the variants, if you want to be extremely generous and say, you know what, I'm not going to count this, I'm not going to count that, I'm going to be as critical as it gets, then 93% of the two versions overlap. Now, how did I come to that number? You look at the number of words or the number of hadith in Farabri's version, you look at the variants in Nasafi's version, and you see what percentage do they agree and what percentage do they disagree. And I think we conclude that you have about 93 to 99. If you're going to be honest, I would say it's about like 97, 98. Very easygoing 99, very critical, and I would say somewhat unfair to the tradition. It'll be 93 at best. The more important question is, Nasafi was an established scholar. He was a judge, and everybody can vouch for his reliability. In the field of hadith, one way of determining the reliability of an individual is you take existing scholars and you compare this new case study with an existing scholar, compare the frequency of agreement to disagreement, and then you can give a ruling on this narrator. For instance, we know Imam Malik is a very famous scholar. Let's say there's another person in his time who his name is Burd ibn Sinan. He's relatively not that well known. So if I want to know he's reliable, one way that scholars would do is, Imam Malik is established. Let me look at all of the hadith of Burd ibn Sinan, compare it with Imam Malik, and if they agree overwhelmingly, I know Burd is reliable. If they disagree overwhelmingly, I know there's something wrong. So what I did was, I took the version of An-Nasafi, all of his variants that are unique to him, I take Farabri's version, and then I compare and see how did commentators deal with both of them. In some instances, about, I'd say maybe 15, 20 instances, they say in this place, Farabri's version is not as sound. It shouldn't be he informed me, it should be he narrated to me. It shouldn't be he went, it should be he came, hypothetically speaking. But then when you look at the times, they agree with Nasafi. They say Nasafi is right in 20 instances, and they say Farabri is right in 20 instances. Meaning, you have an equal number of preferences given, which show that throughout Islamic history, scholars viewed the two of them as equally reliable and objectively reliable as well, because the content of Farabri accorded predominantly, overwhelmingly with the version of An-Nasafi. Which then allows us to just say that the version of Sahih al-Bukhari that we have today can be said without a shadow of doubt is from Imam al-Bukhari overwhelmingly, at least 95%. We have no reason to doubt what is contained between the covers of the Sahih today.
And this conclusion and the research behind it is yours, isn't it? That this is pioneering research. I just want to stress that this is not, you're not commenting on other people's work. This is your own hard-earned conclusion, and it's an extraordinary conclusion, which is why this video is so important. So
yeah, I'll be honest. Like when I first set out to do this research, I was hoping somebody had already done it, because it seems like, it's like low-hanging fruit.
It's so obvious. Surely someone must have done it years ago, but it turns out no one had actually bothered to do it.
And the thing is, so there is a scholar. I'll give credit where credit's due. There's a scholar from Turkey. His name is Fuad Sezgin. He was a Turkish polymath. He's a graduate from a German university. Absolutely phenomenal scholar. He thought about the idea a little bit. He addresses it in like 2-3 pages in his study, But he says, listen, because of the shortage of sources that I have, somebody should take this up. It's been over half a century, and I'm surprised that nobody fleshed out his ideas.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what you're saying, that, subhanAllah, living in the West today, we have a lot of luxuries, and Allah has given us so many opportunities. We should utilize those research opportunities, the databases we have, and the accessibility that we have to produce more cutting edge research. I would like to conclude with just one point. I think this would be an early announcement, a soft launch for a website that I'm starting. I call it the Bukhari Project. SubhanAllah, there's so much content and material out there today on everything. MashaAllah, for the Quran, you have Corpus Quranicum. In the Arabic language, for Sahih al-Bukhari, you have this website called Mawsu'at Sahih al-Bukhari, Bukharipedia. I feel like all of these introductions and programs and courses that are happening, while they're valuable, we need something that's easily accessible, an online platform for everyone for Sahih al-Bukhari. So a few months ago, I decided, you know what, all of this content that's available, why not just put it into a free online source called the Bukhari Project, right? So it'll be an introductory resource on the life and works of Imam al-Bukhari. For instance, one of the things I'm really excited about is I've been working with a team of data visualization experts and scholars on making an interactive map of Imam Bukhari's travels. So you'll have the data, you'll have a map that's shifting and changing from Bukhara to Baghdad to Mecca, which will be a much more immersive experience while you're actually in the footsteps of Imam al-Bukhari. Another important thing we didn't have time to discuss is manuscripts. Like, what is the manuscript tradition of Imam al-Bukhari? Which ones do we have? What are the most valuable, reliable? What do they tell us about the Sahih? What are the variants between them? An overview of the Sahih. And there'll be like a blog where I'll have guest contributors, experts on Sahih al-Bukhari to, present the research. But I thought I'll just put that there for anyone interested. Hopefully in a few weeks, it should be available for everyone to...
Please let us know, and we'll certainly share that around on the various platforms. That's fantastic news. Outstanding work, I must say. Absolutely outstanding, pioneering work. Well done. There's a note on page 20 of your book. There's a story there about various scholars assessing the reliability of Bukhari's collection, and they determined that there were 4 allegedly unreliable hadiths that somehow snuck their way in out of the huge number. Do we know which 4, and is the story even reliable?
Yeah, so in that, supposedly Imam Bukhari went and presented the Sahih to a number of his teachers, such as Yahya ibn Ma'in, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ali ibn al-Madini. So he presents the Sahih to them, and then they say, okay, most of it is reliable, but there are these 4 unreliable hadith. I'm not going to say flat out it's a fabrication, but the source that we get it from, there are some lapses in the transmission, some unknown sources. And based on the data that we know of Imam Bukhari's movements, it's very hard for him to have been presenting the Sahih at that time. So my opinion, and the opinion of others, is that it's not reliable. That argument, that report is not reliable. That is not to say that scholars did not critically engage with Sahih al-Bukhari over the centuries. In fact, one of the most influential defenders of Sahih al-Bukhari was a famous scholar by the name of ad-Daraqutni from Baghdad. He did engage critically with Sahih al-Bukhari. This was a tradition throughout, but we have to understand the nature of their criticism. Yep. It was largely these academic hair-splitting conversations that, oh, did this person hear from that person? Is there an additional narrator? Very few examples will you find of this, what we call content-based criticism, where they feel discomfort with the hadith. There are examples, but it was couched in reverence for the tradition. Now, when we come to the modern era, why is it that any form of critical engagement with the Sahih immediately, raises alarms?
Yeah.
It's because as I mentioned in the opening, what does Sahih al-Bukhari represent for the Muslim community? Sahih al-Bukhari represents the epitome of the Sunni tradition of preserving the prophetic legacy in a meaningful and objective way. Now, when you start, and we're already, the Muslim community is already on the receiving end of Western criticism, a lot of skepticism, internal reforms. You put all of that together, in any other era, these scholars would have no qualms in critically engaging, because their criticism was, was couched in reverence, love, admiration, and the desire to further knowledge. Whereas today, people are extremely skeptical, and they have whole scale skepticism that, oh, Sahih al-Bukhari, oh, this conflicts with my Western worldview. Okay, why are you universalizing your worldview? Oh, I have a problem with the Prophet ﷺ's marriages, his battles. I have a problem with such and such thing. Why are you essentializing and imposing your moral compass on all of humanity? So now when people come with that, it signifies a bigger critique of hadith. And that's why scholars get defensive. Otherwise, historically speaking, there was a very lively debate and discussion.